Okay, well, good evening, afternoon, morning, whatever it is, everybody. I'd just like to introduce myself, Martin Heng. I work for Lonely Planet, and I've worked for Lonely Planet for almost exactly 20 years. I celebrated my 20-year anniversary about a month ago. So I started when the company has gone through several changes in my time. I'm a career editor, actually. I've been working as an editor since the 1980s in England, and I've worked in a lot of different countries, and a lot of different things, and a lot of different kinds of media. But yes, that's but in books mainly for most of my life, and for Lonely Planet for the last 20 years. I was editorial manager for about 8 years. I looked after all the book production, so I know publishing pretty well. But I had, I guess, a catastrophic spinal cord injury. It left me a quadriplegic in 2010. And I guess as a result of that, at the point of the company was restructured, and my job as accessible travel manager was created, which I took after I lost the job of editorial manager. So I was given a job as accessible travel manager, which was really just a job title, and I hadn't really got anything more than that to work on. So since then, really, I've been teaching myself the subject with the help of mentors and peers around the world. So I wouldn't say that I'm an expert. I'm more of a generalist who's come into this field as a result of something that happened to me personally, and as a result of an opportunity that was given to me by Lonely Planet. I'm very grateful for that. But it is now a topic I'm quite passionate about. I've always been a very inveterate traveler. I traveled for a good 10 years before I joined Lonely Planet. I lived in plenty of places. I lived in Japan for 5 years. I lived in Hong Kong, traveled around much of Asia and much of Central America for a long time. So travel was a great passion. And since becoming disabled, it's opened my eyes to the difficulties that travelers face with a disability, and something I'd never considered before, and something most people don't consider until they're faced with it through personal circumstance, whether it's themselves or a family member. And that's something I've found over the last few years is most people do get into accessible travel in whatever way because of this personal connection. So that's a bit of my backstory. But what I'd like to do, I think, really is to introduce accessible or inclusive tourism. Those are the two terms that are generally used. Accessible tourism is more commonly used, but inclusive tourism is possibly a better term, as we might discover this evening. So introduce that, and then maybe explain. You're probably wondering what the connection is between tourism for all, which is the kind of the title of my presentation, what the connection is between that and sustainability in tourism. Well, what I hope to do is to show you what that connection is and why tourism for all is actually not synonymous. And accessible tourism is not synonymous with travel with a disability, and why it's imperative actually that the tourism industry looks carefully at its offerings and its marketing and the way it serves its customers in terms of accessibility in order to remain sustainable. Okay. Here's a definition of accessible tourism for those of you who are not familiar with it. These first couple of slides, they define the kind of core principles. What I'd like to point out with this one is there's a couple of things. And here we got the idea of this is not accessible tourism, it's just inclusive tourism. So this includes people with parents with strollers, people with temporary conditions such as a broken leg or an illness, and most importantly, seniors. And that reference to universal design, that's actually quite a significance. For those of you not familiar with the idea, the concept of universal design, here's a very good and clear definition. The previous slide was a quote from Simon Darcy, who's working here at the University of Technology in Sydney. He's possibly the world's leading academic in the field. And to quote him again, the design, planning, and delivery of tourism services can benefit substantially from their alignment with the principles of universal design. Universal design extends the concept of barrier-free environments to encompass intergenerational planning that recognizes the nexus between aging, disability, and the continuum of ability of people over their lifespan. So to give you some concrete examples of universal design, and there are many, ramps, and these are simple ones, ramps and curb cuts, elevators, these all benefit not only people in wheelchairs and people using mobility aids, but also parents with strollers, people who are delivering goods, older people, And actually, in the tourism context, people with heavy baggage. Everybody these days has got a suitcase with wheels. So these universally designed things benefit all these groups. And that's why it's really useful to think about the use of the word inclusive rather than just simply accessible, because it includes the widest possible range of people. Universal design, this is the gold standard for accessibility, and one for which everybody should really aim. And that's everybody at every level, whether it's kind of business, individual business or region or country. In fact, I think Singapore, Norway, and Japan are the only countries that have officially adopted the principles of universal design. And I think Japan adopted them as a result of, in the lead up to the 2020 Olympics, actually. So this CRPD, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this was adopted in 2006 and was the first human rights treaty of the 21st century. Been signed by 162 countries and ratified by an overwhelming majority. So seeking equality for people with disability is seen as the right thing to do, even by countries with a questionable human rights record. And there are two articles in particular that are particularly relevant to tourism. Here, Article 9 calls for states parties to ensure that people with disabilities have independent, equal access, not only to the physical environment and to transportation and other facilities, but importantly also to information. And Article 30. Now, Article 30 does actually directly refer to tourism and the benefits of tourism, amongst other recreation and sporting activities. Okay, so this symbol, this is universally recognizable. It's the international symbol for disability. But the fact that it's universally recognizable is possibly the only thing this symbol has going for it. It's really done the disability communities quite a big disservice, because in the next few slides, what I want to show you is that accessibility is not all about wheelchairs. The disabled community is incredibly diverse, and its needs are also very, very diverse. I mean, even amongst wheelchair users such as myself, our access needs are also very diverse. I use a power wheelchair. There are manual wheelchair users. I can get up and walk around in a house using a walker, or I can go up and down stairs. I just came back from a holiday, and at least 3 of the places we stayed in had stairs. So although they were not technically accessible, they were perfectly accessible to me. Which is a lesson in itself, is that you can't make assumptions when you talk about accessibility. Accessibility varies from person to person, and when I look for somewhere that's accessible, it's going to be somewhere very different from somebody who's actually stuck in a wheelchair and can't get out of it, and of course totally different from somebody who has a vision impairment. So accessibility is definitely not a one size fits all. This lesser known pictogram is actually a better kind of indication of the diversity of the disabled communities. So you've got cognitive impairment and vision impairment and hearing impairment all represented in the same pictogram. Sadly, not very well known or used. So here we have data. The most recent US Census data. The US Census, the last one, put the number of disabled Americans at 70 million. That's 1 out of every 5 people. And that proportion is about the same throughout the developed world. So these are large numbers of people in sometimes affluent societies. So it's a huge mistake to think of accessible travel as a niche market. It absolutely isn't. And the more progressive destination management organizations, and those are really Germany, Spain, the UK, Flanders, Portugal, and some of the regional destination management organizations, particularly in Spain. They've all recognized this and are promoting accessible tourism quite strongly and tapping into an already large and growing and lucrative market. And they've all realized that actually catering to this market is actually imperative in developing a sustainable tourism strategy. But now I'd like to draw your attention to the breakdown here. And as I said before, disability is not all about wheelchairs. And here you have the figures, 3.6 million wheelchair users. So the mobility impaired, the top line, they outnumber wheelchair users by a factor of 8.5. And there are more people with a vision and a hearing impairment than wheelchair users. If you're putting this in a tourism context, Visit England did a landmark study called the Purple Pound, I think back in 2015, and they came up with similar kind of figures. Wheelchair users make up a very small percentage of the travelers market. You've got them down there at 6%. There are more blind or partially sighted travelers, and in their study, 4 times more travelers with hearing impairments. But I think the biggest takeout from this is the fact that up to 3/4 of people traveling with a disability have invisible disabilities. So long-term illness, people who are deaf, of course, you wouldn't know by looking at them. Many people who are mobility impaired, again, you wouldn't necessarily know by looking at them. Say, if I'm sitting there with a walking aid next to me, you wouldn't necessarily know I had an impairment. And by far, the largest group is actually just long-term illness, and that covers a multitude of illnesses, including, for example, diabetes. And allergies as well, must be said. Allergies is also considered a long-term illness, and engenders access needs, which are becoming actually more and more common, as you might know. The incidence of food intolerances, and also intolerances to other substances is becoming more common. This is fairly up to date, and a recent study for Tourism Australia from 2018. Similar story. So again, disability does not equate to wheelchair users. And here we have mobility wheelchair users down at 9%. Again, those suffering from hearing impairments and outnumber wheelchair users. And again, invisible disabilities far outnumber visible disabilities. Here's some European data. And this is data relating to the working age population. So it's actually fast becoming a social and economic imperative to provide accessible infrastructure. Look at the UK. It's estimated that 7 million people of working age have a disability. And their spending power, the so-called purple pound or purple dollar in other countries, but in England, the purple pound is reckoned to be worth about £249 billion to the UK economy annually. This slide shows the diversity of disability across the EU for people of working age. What it doesn't show is how an aging demographic will affect these figures. Already, about 80 million people in the EU are affected by disability, and that figure will inevitably rise as the population ages. By 2050, a staggering 35% of the European population will be over 60 years old, and they might expect to enjoy 20 years of retirement. This one is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, looking at demographic trends. And again, although it's from the ABS, you'll find this pattern is kind of replicated throughout the developed world. Japan is probably a little bit ahead of the game in this respect. When I was living there back in the 90s, Japan was already talking about the graying of the population, and that's because it's a very long-lived society. So they're already facing the issues of a graying society back in the 1990s, and with all that entails, whether it's accessibility or whether it's kind of a shrinking tax base to cater to an aging pension base. So what we have here is a similar pattern, and it's quite remarkable that when you look at the figures, look at the figures into the history of 2050. So the Tourism Research Australia study, which I quoted earlier, says in relation to this demographic change that with an estimated 20% of Australian adults having a disability or long-term health condition and an aging population, the disability sector is set to grow. By 2050, it is estimated that nearly 1/4 of the population will be aged 65 or over. In 2015, 5 million people had long-term health conditions in Australia, and this is also expected to grow. The overall growth in the aging population in both volume and longer life expectancy is expected to lead to greater numbers of travellers who may need extra assistance. And there you have it in a nutshell. Basically, with the aging demographic, the people will be traveling, and those people who are traveling will have greater access needs. Skipping over to the US, the Open Doors organization is a Chicago-based organization, and they've done a couple of studies over the last few years on travel by people with disability. And this is part of the most recent study looking at disability prevalence by age in the US. And you can see that, echoing a much earlier study done by McKinsey & Co. probably 15 years ago now, it reveals that almost 40% of people will retire with an acquired disability. 10 years later, this figure rises to 56%, while more than 70% of people aged 80 and over will have access needs due to an acquired disability. So if you remember, I said people will retire at 60, 65, they can expect to have 20 years of retirement, and that takes them into their 80s. So by that stage, 70% of them will have some sort of access need, whether it's hearing or sight or mobility. Going back to the study by Visit England, the Purple Power study, another misconception that people have is that people with a disability don't travel. Well, this study is very important, and one of several studies, and the Tourism Australia study was another, to show that people with a disability do actually travel, and that we travel with aspirations that are very similar to the general public. And yes, it is true that the unemployment rate among disabled people is higher. There are plenty of people, including myself, who have jobs and have disposable income. More importantly, the baby boomer generation, as I've said, 40% of whom will retire with some form of acquired disability, is perhaps the first generation in human history that's not focused on passing on its wealth to its offspring. Instead, it's intent on enjoying retirement. And I'm sure you've all heard that from your parents or your grandparents or your uncles, your aunts, is I've earned my retirement and now I'm going to enjoy it, you know. And in most cases, that does involve travel. And economic studies show that, particularly in developing countries, the baby boomers are controlling an ever increasing share of both income and leisure. So they're cashed up and they want to travel. Again, from the Purple Pound study, this study reinforces the importance of the Purple Pound to domestic tourism. And significantly, this slide shows a much stronger growth in the market segment than for the sector overall. And as time goes by, this market segment will constitute an ever-growing share of the total market. So catering to this market is actually future-proofing your business and should form part of any sustainable tourism strategy, whether it's at the business level, the individual business level, or the local level, the regional level, or indeed the international level. Back to the Open Doors organization, and again, similarly large figures are revealed by this study. I should have mentioned before, going back a couple of slides, if you look at the top left-hand corner of the 12.4 billion pounds, it says spent on trips where a member of the party has an impairment. So this is not money that is spent only by people with a disability, but it's spent by people where a member of the party has an impairment. So they've arrived at this figure by using what's called the multiplier effect. So the multiplier effect is the fact that people with disability don't travel alone, less likely to travel alone as well than able-bodied people. So take myself, for example. I have a wife and three children. So if I can't use a product or service, then the business loses out, not on one person's business, but 5. So the multiplier effect is usually something between 3 and 4, depending on the study. So if I go back to the slide I was looking at before, if you use the multiplier effect, and this is over 2 years, so divide by 2 and multiply by 3, then the total spent on travel in the US by a party, including a member with a disability, would give a figure of more than $50 billion per annum. So as I said, it's not a niche market and it's not a small market. Back to the Tourism Australia study. And we've got a study here that was focused only on the domestic market in 2 states. That's Queensland and Victoria. So comparatively tiny market. But nevertheless, the estimated annual expenditure by tourists with disability is around 3.2 billion, or 4% of the annual total. And again, using the multiplier effect, this means the true value of the spend is up to $8 billion. And what this study also found, which isn't shown on this slide, is that growth in the value of accessible tourism is actually stronger than the growth in the value of the much vaunted Chinese tourism sector, which was a very surprising finding. Amadeus, which is a major, I'm sure most of you have heard of Amadeus as a major kind of technology supplier to the travel industry. They did a study in 2017 for which I was also interviewed and contributed to, and it quite nicely sums up what I've just been talking about. The travel industry will need to cater to an aging demographic and a growing proportion of travelers with access needs. So the UN Development Programme, which I'm sure you're very familiar with these goals, but what they show, I think, is that there is a happy intersection between accessibility and sustainability. That is, an aging demographic means that in order for tourism, and indeed in general, smart cities, to remain sustainable, accessibility needs to be a core part of any strategic forward planning. And this intersection is being increasingly widely recognized both by city planners and destination management organizations, and not to mention the United Nations. So in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the SDGs explicitly mention disability and persons with disabilities 11 times. Disability is referenced in multiple parts of the SDGs, specifically in parts related to education and growth and employment, inequality, accessibility of human settlements. And although the word disability is not cited directly in all goals, it's also noticeable how often the word inclusive appears. And here we go back to the idea of accessible tourism and inclusive tourism. I think the word inclusive is actually a good, I personally believe it's a better way of expressing what we're talking about here. And so inclusive in terms of both social justice and demographic change. So in its 2011 declaration, UNWTO predicted that tourism will reach 1.8 billion international tourists by 2030. So given current and projected statistics on disability and demographic change, building accessible infrastructure and providing accessible tourism services will ensure full social and economic inclusion with the direct benefit of creating more sustainable tourism growth. So I think it's important not just to focus on the built environment and built infrastructure. We're living in a digital age, and the importance of fully accessible websites can't be underestimated. Again, it's not just a human rights issue, providing access to all information, access to information for everybody. But it's also an economic imperative. Those of you in the US might have noticed there's a significant uptick in litigation against companies for the inaccessibility of their websites. Domino's and Target are probably the most prominent victims of litigation. Domino's just lost an appeal to the higher court because their websites are not accessible primarily to people with vision impairments. But actually, it's the economic imperative that will probably shift the dial, sadly. And this study from 2016 shows why. This study found that most businesses aren't even aware that they're losing business, because more than 90% of customers who have difficulty using a site will simply not contact them. In the UK alone, around 6.1 million internet users have impairments that affect the way they use the internet. And this survey shows that over 80% of them will spend their money not on the website that offers the cheapest products, but where fewest barriers are placed in their way. So in fact, 71% of these customers will just click away from websites that don't cater to their needs. And remember, we're not just talking about people with disability, but older people as well, and people who don't identify as disabled but do have access needs, and indeed difficulties with technology. So, Lonely Planet, we've actually got only one core value, and that is that travel is a force for good when practiced or carried out responsibly. We basically try with our raison d'etre is to give travelers information they need to make informed decisions about where to go and how to travel. In order to travel independently, what we believe people need is trustworthy information. And we help travelers to get the best out of their trips by providing them with unbiased, unconflicted, independent information so that they can make informed decisions. There's no such thing as free choice or informed decisions without access to information, which is why, going back to the websites, why it's very, very important that websites are accessible. But sadly, they're not. And here's the thing, the greater your access needs, the greater your need for accessibility, the greater your need for planning using detailed and accurate information. Ironically, unfortunately, commercial websites, particularly, accessibility information is either missing or just hidden away under FAQs. And what's worse, customer-facing staff in hotels and other tourist facilities are usually quite uninformed and unable to answer even the most basic questions about the accessibility of their establishments. And I sort of lost track of the number of times I've called any number of venues and asked if there's a step into the establishment, and the person on the end of the line said, "Oh, hang on, I'll go and have a look," because they've never noticed. And why should they? Well, they shouldn't notice if it's not their business, but actually it is their business as hosts to know what barriers there might be for their customers, and that goes for restaurants as much as hotels. So what are we doing? So Lonely Planet has made a modest start. I work pretty much on my own. I've produced half a dozen guides so far. My pilot guide was Accessible Melbourne. I produced an Accessible Rio guide for the Olympics, and I gave one copy to each Paralympic athlete, and the rest were provided free as free downloads. And the IPC have already signed up for a 2020 guide to Tokyo, so I'm working on that right now. I've done 3 guides to British destinations, and I found that quite a good model to do that is to team up with a local disabled people's organisation that has the access data, which I then complement our core data with. So we're using the expertise of local disabled people's organisations and putting their information together with ours to create these accessible guides. Currently working on a London guide with a fantastic organisation called Access Able in the UK. They used to be called Disable Go, and they have literally hundreds of thousands of points of interest. And we're going to be using their data to produce an accessible London guide in the next year, within the next year. I guess my most significant achievement, I think, is this accessible travel online resources, which is the world's largest collection of online resources for traveling with access needs. This was recognized by the UNWTO as one of a handful of examples of best practice in accessible tourism. And this is now in its 3rd edition. It's vastly expanded. I'm constantly hoovering up websites and adding to them. I'll be putting out a 4th edition next year. Last year, I put out a kind of companion title, which is Accessible Travel Phrasebook. This contains about 100 words and phrases translated into 35 languages. Phrases that are going to assist disabled travelers to make their needs known. Phrases that wouldn't necessarily be in a regular guidebook. So all of these titles are available for free. They're not available in print, apart from the Rio guide, which was available in a short print run for the athletes. Plus, I had some as giveaways. But everything else we're providing free to the general public as a service. We don't just do that. We also publish articles on the website around accessible tourism. We have guest bloggers and we have guest feature writers. This is Sylvia Corbella-Longmire, who's a very prominent US blogger. She's got her own style of using. She uses She uses drone to create video blogs for the vlogs as well. I actually used that very same wheelchair when I was in the Costa Brava 3 weeks ago. Amphibious wheelchair. I sailed on this ship, the SV Tenacious, run by the Jubilee Sailing Trust. As an accessible tall ship, a 3-masted bark. I sailed from Sydney to Melbourne, which was a 9-day sail. They have 2 ships. They have this beautiful wooden ship and also the Lord Nelson. This was the Tenacious, also built by a mixed ability crew as well as crewed by a mixed ability crew. They were in strife and just had to they were trying to raise £1 million the week before last to stay in business, and they managed to raise £1 million to keep them in business. They managed to do that in a week, which is great. So I guess my question is, if they can create an accessible tool ship, there's not really any excuse for businesses, mainstream tourism operators, not to make their facilities more accessible. And if you're interested in my adventure on the tall ship, you can probably find that on Lonely Planet. If you search for Martin Heng or Tenacious, you'll come up with that. So I guess summing up, improving accessibility will immediately benefit local communities and local economies as well as tourists. It'll benefit individual tourism service providers through increased tourist numbers. And importantly, emphasis should be placed on access to information regarding accessibility through fully accessible websites, as well as a concerted program of tourism sector staff training in disability awareness. In the longer term, catering to people with access needs, whether they identify as disabled or not, and taking into account demographic change and consequently changes to the distribution of disposable income, is to lay the foundations of a sustainable tourism strategy, whether at the individual business, the regional, or the national level. So I guess that's my coda to finish off with, and yeah, I'd be very happy to take questions.